How do I know God exists? This is a question that most of us ask ourselves at some point in life, maybe more than once. And I would respond by first asking you, well, how do you know anything? Or since God is not exactly a thing, how do you come to know? I think once we answer that question, right, how do you come to know? Then we'll have a better idea of how you can come to know that God exists or doesn't exist, or whether it's impossible for us to know such a thing. But at the very least, we need to re-examine our epistemological presuppositions in a very fancy way, re-examine or kind of look into how we come to know things. And I think that will give us insight into how we might know that God exists. Now, what I submit to you is that there are typically three ways in which we know things. One is through what is unfortunately called intuition in the English language, but which I think is more appropriately called immediate knowledge, or knowledge without a medium, something that you know immediately within your consciousness. For instance, the content of your own thoughts, the content of your imagination, the fact that you exist, the fact that you are conscious. These are all things that are happening subjectively. So there's no medium. You immediately kind of grasp these things. It's not out there in the external world kind of thing. The second is through deductive reasoning. So that's when we have certain premises, Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, and therefore Socrates is mortal. And don't mind my friend Ali over there in the background grabbing his food. The third way is through inductive reasoning. So that would be something like, what a detective does. So you gather evidence and then you come up with a hypothesis that may or may not be true, but you find something that's probably true that can account for all of the evidence, something that the evidence in a certain sense points to, but not necessarily. In the case of deductive reasoning, the premises necessarily lead to the conclusion. There's just no way to rationally avoid it without contradicting yourself. Whereas with inductive reasoning, no, there could be an alternative hypothesis, but it's just not as likely. Now, these are the three ways in which we typically know things. And you might notice that I excluded something, which is sense perception. I mean, don't we know things by seeing them? After all, don't you know that right now you are looking at a computer screen, and therefore that a computer screen exists, and there's somebody on the other end, speaking to you, and whatever. That seems like how we know a lot of things, through simple observation. And what I would submit to you is actually that no, the way we know that is through a combination of immediate knowledge as well as reason. And I'm going to explain all of these in a second. Now, what I wanted this video to be is a general introduction to how we might know God exists in basically the three methods that I outlined, immediately, or through one of the two forms of mediate knowledge, namely deductive inference or inductive inference. So I wanted to explain what each of these are, and perhaps in this video I will go into the first one, which is immediate knowledge, how we might know God immediately. And the other two I will leave for a later video, in which we will go in depth explaining the difference between deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning, between proof and evidence in a technical sense, and then go into actual proofs or evidence for the existence of God. What's important to note is this, that the first thing I want to show you here, and I'm going to explain why sense perception does not actually play a role as much as you think it does. And that's not to say it doesn't play a role at all. It definitely does. But that it's more a combination of things. So let me explain this more clearly. So here we have my little drawing pad. And I find that it's easier to explain certain things visually. And so this is going to be an in-depth video, and we will get into some technical stuff here, but hopefully it'll be easy enough to follow with this drawing pad. So I want you to imagine this as, your consciousness, right? And let me just adjust the camera here. Okay. So imagine this is your consciousness, and this is the world out here, right? And, you see Bob, okay? So here's Bob out here in the world, presumably. And what happens is, this little thing comes up where you now see Bob, okay? Okay, so what's happening here is you think that you are seeing Bob, but in reality, what you are seeing is an image of Bob in your mind. And you are then inferring that there actually exists a Bob out here in reality using reason. Okay, now how do we know that you're not actually seeing Bob himself in your mind? Well, there's a couple of reasons. First of all, Bob is made up of matter, and what's in your mind, the image of Bob obviously is not. Second of all, the reason why we know that you're not seeing Bob or out external reality directly is because sometimes you make a mistake. Right? So if you're sometimes making a mistake about what's up here, it means that what's in your mind is not actually the thing itself. It is a image, a representation, something which is representing something out in the external world. So now, how we can reliably do this is a huge concern in epistemology. We're not going to go into that, but I think that in general, people think that this is reliable. I see Bob, therefore I infer Bob exists out there in the world, that it's not simply a figment of my imagination, that my own mind is not all that exists. And so you infer something about the external world. So sense perception stays basically on this side of the divide. You can think of this as the subjective, although I don't like that word, right? The subjective side. You're not going into the external reality here. You always infer. What gets you from the subjective to the objective is typically reason when you're inferring something exists in the external world. Now, what I'd like to do is first show you another example of this from my blog here. One second. So if you see over here, we have a picture of two glasses of a straw broken in a glass, but your eyes deceive you, right? We all know that the straw is not actually broken, but it only appears that way to us. So from these simple things, you can understand that you're not actually seeing the thing itself. What you are seeing is an image in your mind. So this is something kind of trippy when you think about it, because this is kind of what Descartes was on about when he said, well, how do I know that I'm not in a dream? Because, if you imagine that what you're seeing is really this is all that you have access to. You don't have access to this. Well, who's to say this whole thing, this world, who's to say that this is really representing that? That's a huge problem, as I said, in epistemology, but I think most people are going to accept that, yeah, you know what, I may not be able to exactly explain how, but when I have an image in my mind, it does typically represent external reality in some way. Yeah, sure, some people are colorblind. Some people might, maybe sometimes you have a deja vu or whatever. But typically what's happening here is correlating to something in reality. We're going to assume that's true for the most part, because otherwise we're going to get into a very deep discussion to do with epistemology, which most people, in the end, they are going to accept that external reality exists anyway. So we'll just take that as kind of a given. But the point that I'm making here is simply that you're not perceiving it directly. You are inferring it. Okay, that's very important to know. You are inferring things that exist. Things exist out there in the world. Now, on this side, what we have is immediate knowledge. Now, when I say immediate, I mean without a medium. So immediate, right? That's like without a medium, right? And the reason for that is this. If you see here, this is immediate knowledge. Your knowledge of Bob here is mediated by the image in your mind. However, this image itself, immediately. Your consciousness grasps this directly. Your consciousness grasps, for instance, when you are hungry, right? I'm going to put this H for hunger. When you are hungry, this kind of just comes into your consciousness, right? And you grasp it immediately. And you might even think about your own hunger. You might say, I am hungry. And, your let me move this over a little bit. So your own knowledge of your hunger here is also immediate. Right? Your own knowledge of your own thoughts is also immediate. You don't it's not some kind of inference that you're making to the external world. You grasp it directly. You can't doubt, for instance, that you are seeing an image of Bob. You might doubt that Bob exists out there in reality. You might say, maybe I'm in a dream. You might say, maybe I'm hallucinating. But you can never deny the fact that it appears as though Bob exists. Likewise, you never make a mistake about what you think you are thinking, because it appears immediately. You can never make a mistake about whether you feel hungry. Okay? None of that ever happens. Now, so immediate knowledge, we're going to say is divided into two, deductive and inductive. Now, these we're going to cover in future series. For now, what we're going to focus on is this side of the divide. Now, this is really important because typically we think of God as, I don't know, some bearded man in the sky, right, who's like super powerful. This is going to be his muscles, right? Super powerful old man in there in the sky, or like this bodiless mind. But the point is that God is something out there in the world, and we have to infer from our consciousness. We have to have some kind of image and then infer using reason the existence of God, of this either bodiless mind or whatever, there's some kind of conception. So we're going to have a representation here that's going to infer using reason. And it's for that reason that people typically are like, okay, well, what's your proof and evidence that God exists? The reason why people are saying this is because they're thinking God is another thing out there, and we're going to prove using reason. And definitely you can prove some things out there about the external reality, namely that something approximating God exists, meaning an all-powerful, infinite, absolute being must exist out there. I believe that you can demonstrate this metaphysically. But the point is that there's also another way in which God is known, which is the subjective. Now, what I would say is this, that for most believers, in fact, there is a combination of the two going on, but the primary ends up being this, meaning that in the same way that you might experience your own hunger, right? And you can think about your own hunger in the abstract. You can say, I am hungry, or Bob is hungry. And in fact, you can feel hungry without actually thinking I am hungry, and you can think I am hungry without actually being hungry. Right now, if I told you, think I am hungry in your mind, you can do it, and maybe you're not necessarily hungry. Similarly, you can think about somebody else being hungry. This is all your abstract mind going on here. Now, within your own consciousness, right, which you're grasping immediately, there's something which I call, I guess, or not really it's really a Quranic term, the divine light, so to speak. So it's an experience like hunger, except you might think of it here as this is supposed to be a light, but my drawing really sucks, so you're going to have to, that's supposed to be like a shining luminous light, like the sun or something, okay? So whatever. Now, this experience, right? Wait, sorry, before I go into this, my apologies. Okay, my apologies. Imagine somebody had never been in love before. Okay, they had never experienced love. Now, even if you gave them all of the objective facts about love, if you told them the neuroscience behind love, if you told them what causes love, what chemicals are released into the human body when somebody is in love, none of that would constitute knowledge of what love is. Okay, in order for a person to know what love is, or what hatred is, or what greed is, or what pettiness is, or what have you, they have to actually experience it themselves. In other words, it has to be on this side of the divide. It has to enter their consciousness. In the same way, hunger, pain, love, hatred, all of this has to come in here for them to actually understand what it is. And furthermore, what I would submit to you is that this is some kind of reality. This is some kind of reality. In other words, oftentimes what is there in the subjective side of things is dismissed. Okay, this is just subjective, right? You like chocolate, the other person doesn't like chocolate. However, what I would say is this. Are you so sure, right, that ultimate reality comes down to material, something physical, something like energy, something physics can describe? Or does it come down to consciousness? I don't know, right? I don't know. But I'm saying that it's certainly possible that consciousness is the fundamental reality, in which case, actually, all that stuff on the subjective side is perhaps more significant than you might think. Now, obviously, from a religious point of view, I do believe that you can actually show that consciousness is the fundamental nature of reality. So I shouldn't say I don't know. I believe I do know that consciousness is definitely more fundamental than the fundamental aspect of reality and not matter. But that's a discussion for a future episode. For now, I'm going to just take it as, it could be. So that's the first thing. The second thing is this. Now, suppose here we have the universe. Okay, so just ignore all of this for a second. The universe. Okay, and we typically think of our mind as part of the universe. Like, in other words, if I ask you, well, where do you exist? You would say, well, I exist within space-time, within the universe. So your mind, your consciousness is within this greater thing. If that is the case, right? If that is the case, then clearly mind is somehow part of the universe. So if there's some kind of reality here, right, love or hatred or hunger or whatever, then it clearly is in some way part of the universe. It is something to do with the fundamental nature of the universe. Otherwise, what's it doing in the universe? How could it be within the universe? Now, there are different conceptions for the relationship between mind and matter. Some people say that there is no matter, there's only mind. Some people say that there is no mind, only matter. Some people say that there's both, and actually they coexist in two totally different realms. That's neither here nor there. On a typical, let's say, scientific atheistic worldview, this is more or less accurate. Now, given that that's the case, right? Given that that's the case, if something, as I said, hunger is over here, or consciousness, the experiences of consciousness are themselves somehow part of the fundamental nature of the universe, then so too, this experience of what I call the divine light, okay? This, experience for people who have experienced it, and I believe most believers have experienced this to some extent. Remember, this isn't a 0 or 100 kind of thing. It's a continuum. So maybe some people have experienced it like 10%, some people like 2%, some people like 99%, right? When people have experienced this kind of changes the way that they view the world. And I believe most religious believers have experienced this to some degree throughout their lives, and that's why they believe in God. It's kind of like why when you feel hunger, you know that you're hungry, right? Even if some people might say, okay, well, how do I know that I actually have enough nutrients or whatever? Because that's what your hunger is supposed to be indicating is, for instance, that you haven't eaten in a while, you need to refresh you need to gain more nutrients and what have you. And I'd say, okay, yeah, all of that stuff, maybe that's false, but the actual feeling of hunger can never be false. Given that that's the case, if this thing is a fundamental experience, an emotion, a more than an emotion, a fundamental thing that a person immediately knows from within the depths of their consciousness, if it is something like love, that only a person who has experienced love can know what love means and knows that actually this is in a sense, a more real experience than anything else out there in the universe. When you've seen that, then you come to believe, you come to know, and you come to understand, right? You come to understand. Why? Because you have immediate knowledge of it. You have knowledge of it in the same way that you have knowledge of your own thoughts, of your own emotions, of your own, and so forth. You have knowledge of the divine. In other words, the subject and the object unite in this case. There's something that crosses the bridge here between the subject and the world, and something somehow crosses the bridge here, and you see through this kind of the fundamental nature of reality through your own subjective consciousness. So there's 3 basic questions left that I want to cover in this video. The first is the following. If this, what I'm calling the divine light, this experience of God, is something that's purely within our subjective mind, then, okay, who cares? We already know religious believers see this within their own mind, so who cares? This is just their subjective feeling. It has no objective reality, this kind of idea. The second thing is, okay, how would I experience this, this light that you're saying is within somebody? They can experience it within their own consciousness. They can know it immediately and infallibly. How then do I experience this? The third question is just a general question of what is it exactly that is going to satisfy you if you are asking the question, how do I know God exists? What is it that's going to satisfy you? So these are the 3 questions that remaining. As for the first question, right, if this is something that's simply within the subjective mind, then it doesn't say anything about the real world, so who cares, right? In which case, first of all, what I would tell you is then you're going to have to apply the same logic to all the things that human beings care about. Love, hatred, goodness, morality, evil. All of that is just going to be subjective nonsense. It's not going to mean anything, and you shouldn't really care about it. But of course, that's not true. In fact, all the things that we care about are actually within the subjective mind, number 1. Number 2, as we said, if the mind is part of the universe, then clearly there is something in here. This is indicating something about the fundamental nature of the universe. There's no way to reduce the mind to simply matter. There just isn't, right? These experiences are in and of themselves in some way real, right? They're in some way real. And when you really accept that or internalize that, then you realize that, okay, if I'm having an experience within my own consciousness, this is actually something that is integral to the nature of reality. Furthermore, even if God only existed, quote unquote, within the mind, it doesn't make God any less real. The reason is because, as I said, let's say only love was only within the mind. It's not out there in the matter. Okay, but does that make love any less real? No. It is an experience. It is there in reality. And it is, of course, a presumption. We have no idea whether or not this divine light, right? If you've never seen it before, you have no idea whether or not it is simply within the subjective mind or it expands into all of reality. And we have no reason to presume that. But the point is that even if you were to take that presumption, it still indicates something fundamental about the nature of reality, because consciousness is something fundamental about the nature of reality. It is experience. It's the way things are. And if hunger didn't exist anywhere outside the human mind, it would still be real. If the divine light didn't exist anywhere outside the human mind, it would still be real. The experience itself is the reality. What I'm saying to you is this: you're kind of still stuck in this mode where you're thinking God is out here, right? Where you're thinking God is this old man in the sky. I have to prove this exists. And we can't do that. We can do that using inductive, and we can prove it using deductive reasoning, and we can give evidence for it using and use inductive reasoning to determine that this is out there in the world. But what I'm saying is, what if you're thinking about this the wrong way? What if the experience is the reality, right? What if the experience is the reality, in the same way that the experience of love is the reality? The experience of hatred is the reality, right? That's what I'm trying to get at, is that, it's not necessarily something out there. It can be within here. And that's something that religions have actually been kind of clear about in their history. That's not to say they denied that God was, a fundamental reality out there, the creator of the universe and so forth. But it is to say that there was this idea within traditional religions. So we're talking Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, and so forth, that, look, at the root of one's consciousness, okay, so you can think of this as your conscious mind, okay? So here's kind of the perimeter of your consciousness, and this is the root of your consciousness, that as you travel within here, within this, to the center of your consciousness, you find that there's actually something deeper inside, and that this is the divine within you. Now, obviously, there's a heretical way to understand what that means when I say the divine is within you, and a correct way to understand that. Within the Islamic tradition, we have the verse of the Quran, وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِمْ مِنْ رُوحِي, and I blew unto them of my spirit. And so there is something at the root of all consciousness, and in fact, all creation, that is attached to God, so to speak, that is attached to God. So this comes to the second question, right? How do I know God exists? Or how do I know, using this method of immediate knowledge? How do I come to know or experience this thing that, I'm talking about, the divine light? The answer is through spiritual practice. So we see here that this is in fact a continuum, right? So we have 100 here, and we'll have 0 here. So this is kind of the perimeter of your being. This is where your stream of thoughts is just kind of constantly going, and you can't really stop it. And you're like following every single one of your thoughts. You're like, oh, this. And this is the mode in which you're constantly in need of, listening to music all the time, and in the mode of constantly thinking and getting anxious and depressed, and why this and why that. And you can't stop your own thoughts, and you're constantly looking for new forms of entertainment and something to keep you busy. That's kind of the perimeter of your being, right? However, as you kind of, through contemplation, reflection, and spiritual practice, what you do is you kind of, so this is the continuum here, we're just putting here. What you do is you travel from here inwardly, okay, inwardly. And as you do that, your vision of the divine increases. Now, you don't have to go 100% of the way there, even if you go 1% or 10% or whatever. Wherever you reach, that's going to increase your knowledge of the divine. So what I would submit to somebody who might be a disbeliever, right, an atheist who says there is no God, and, I just came here for the proof and the evidence, is this. What if I told you, right, that, in science, one of the things that's valued is experimental evidence, right? Experimental evidence. To do an experiment that is repeatable and to get an effect, and that gives you evidence of something. Now, what I would suggest to you is, what if the evidence what if the experiment here is your own consciousness? What if you could experiment within your own consciousness to see the divine in that way? Are you so sure you would be that this would be a waste of time? I would submit to you that the people who have undergone this journey constitute the mystics of the world, right? That the different world religions all have people who have done this, who are mystics, who have confirmed to us that this stuff exists. And you don't have to take their word for it. You can do it yourself. You can practice. You can go through this spiritual discipline and practice, and you don't have to go, once again, 100 of the way there. You don't have to completely, just abandon the world and go into a cave or something. Even if you go 10% of the way there, I really believe that you will see something deeper to the meaning of reality and creation. And I think it'll come immediately within your consciousness, and you'll grasp it and you'll understand it, that you'll get a new kind of vision. Now, one of the quickest ways to, when I say spiritual practice, one of the quickest ways to travel down here is by doing good deeds. And the reason is because, as we'll see later, that God is equal to the good. In other words, goodness is, in a sense, of his attributes, one of his essence, is part of his essence. And so any person who grasps the good also grasps God. So when you truly work sincerely to do good deeds, this, in a sense, helps you recognize the divine essence within the eye of your heart, this kind of experience, this experience in consciousness, the center of which is actually the heart, not the mind. Or I should say one of the modalities of which is the heart, not the mind, sorry. Although within the actual seat of consciousness, it does happen within the intellect. Anyway, these are all technicalities which I've covered in blog posts. You guys can check out my blog at TheMuslimTheist.com. I'll put the link in the description, and you guys can get more detail on some of this stuff if I've been unclear. In any case, God is the good. And so as you do good deeds, you get closer to the good. You embody the good. And so you see the good. And so you see God. This experience within consciousness. There was an atheist named the Raving Atheist, I believe, something like that, who was, really anti-theistic, and, like he was at the top of this new atheist movement. And one of the things he started doing was he started volunteering with pro-life organizations, because he somehow felt that abortion was still wrong, even as an atheist. There was something about it that just didn't, or I think he was exploring it, and he came to the conclusion after seeing abortion, after seeing the women who go through abortion, after talking to the pro-life activists, that this was something, abortion was something wrong, and he wanted to join a pro-life organization and to promote that. And he did it as an atheist. And over a period of time, he worked sincerely, and he just became a Christian. He said, look, I know the rational arguments, and, I know I've been writing about this stuff, but I've seen an experience, right? I can't unsee this experience. I don't know if my glasses are, the light is reflecting poorly here, so hopefully this will stop the light from reflecting on the camera. I don't know what's going on with that, but hopefully that hasn't been too distracting. In any case, he eventually became a believer in God, simply through good action. This is what I mean when I say through spiritual practice. This doesn't necessarily have to be something extremely, extremely technical, and we think of spiritual practice as like this image immediately comes of like this guru who's sitting in like the lotus position and what have you. A lot of the time spiritual practice is a lot simpler than you think. It's simply doing a good deed, or holding yourself back from doing something that is wrong, holding yourself back from a temptation. Now, given that is the case, I think it's very accessible and very plausible for a person to try this. Now, there is a problem with all of this, which is, if this is the case, that we can know God immediately, why do we even need to go into this issue of evidence and proof and what have you? Just tell an atheist, look, you want to know God, do this, and that's it. In the end, he doesn't want to do it, go, that's his problem, not, we don't have to care. What I would say is no, that's not the case, for a couple of reasons. First of all, what I would say is there is a couple of reasons why we need proof, as well as this kind of immediate knowledge method, this pure immediate knowledge method. The reason is because First of all, we kind of demand that God make himself known on all of the levels of being. What do I mean by this? God manifests and all of reality comes from God. This is the kind of idea behind God. Human beings have many different facets to their being. We enjoy beauty. We have, we're very active. We have, anger and kind of this warrior mentality within us. Every single one of us, right? Some people lean one way more than the other. Some people lean more towards being a very cognitive, rational kind of person. Some people lean more towards being a warrior type. Some people lean more towards being an artsy type. And we have many different types of people. All of us have all of these qualities to some extent or another, but some people lean one way more than the other. Now, for the people who lean in the direction of very strict cognitive proofs and evidence, there has to be what's called itmam al-hujja in Arabic, which means the completion of the proof. In other words, in order for that person to be culpable, and really something within their fitra, within their innate nature, that they're thinking, okay, if I'm going to worship this so supposedly all-powerful God, then I have to know that God exists. Why can't this God show me that he exists? And so on each level, right, within the realm of art, God has to show that he exists, right? And I think religions have produced the most beautiful music in the world, and there's a kind of proof there of the existence of God within the art itself, within the beauty of the art itself, right? Whether it be musical art or melodic art or visual art or what have you, there has to be that indication of God's existence there. Likewise, in the realm of reason, right? In the realm of reason, we have to see that no, we can know something about God. However, I would say there's an important distinction to keep in mind, which is this: whenever you prove God through reason, if you remember that divide between the world and the subject, what we said was like, here's your consciousness and here's the image of Bob you have in your mind, and then here's Bob out here in reality. So what I would say is this, that and you use reason to bridge the gap. Now, what I would say is this: even if you could prove that there is something out here correlating to a concept of God in here, and so you have therefore proved that God exists, right? Always remember that the proof for the existence of God is going to begin with immediate knowledge, things that you know within your own subject, within your own subjective experience. That's just an important point I thought I would note, and it's something I will get more in detail into when I go into the difference between proof and evidence. I'm going to show that actually both of them ultimately are grounded in immediate knowledge. That's the only way to ground them, right? So for example, the principle of non-contradiction is something the mind grasps immediately, but that's something that we'll cover in its appropriate place. Now, there's a second reason why we need proof and evidence. So we demand God, manifest himself. Two, there are people who incline towards different kinds of proclivities, and so there needs to be something that appeals to them. There has to be something that appeals to the artsy types, to the cognitive types, to the warrior types, everything. Okay, so the third is that there is basically this, let's say you know God through this immediate knowledge, within your subjective mind, you're seeing the divine light, and let's say you've kind of done the spiritual practice and you've gone to like here, let's say, okay? Now, what happens when you stop engaging in those spiritual practices? What happens then? Well, what ends up happening is, in the same way you can go this way, you can go this way, right? You can go towards the perimeter of your being, and you can get back stuck in the stream of thoughts and, anxiety and all of this stuff where you need something to calm you down, as opposed to retreating to the center of your being. Now, when that happens, you're coming back this way, right? And what happens is you could come over here where literally all you experience within your consciousness is darkness. You don't see the divine light at all. Or it starts getting dimmer and dimmer and dimmer until it kind of fades. And when that happens, you're going to have a crisis of belief. This, I believe, is what happens to most of those atheists who say, like, I was a Christian for like 20 years, whatever, and then, the light of reason came to me, and then, now I don't believe in that mumbo jumbo anymore. What happens is this: they were believing in God because typically, sometimes, no, it was just because they were raised that way, what have you. But usually the ones that I think convert to or become atheists later on in life, they usually had some minimal experience of God. through the commission of major sins and a lack of spiritual practice, they eventually moved towards this side of their being. And because they didn't have any reason, what happens is they just said, okay, therefore God doesn't exist. When you have reason, what it does is it acts as like an anchor over here, or really all the way over here, right? It acts as a reason to show you that this point actually really does exist. And it will continually push you in this direction, meaning that even if you no longer see the light of God within your consciousness, if you know rationally that God has to exist, it is something which continually pushes you back in the direction of spiritual practice. It gives you a reason to continue that spiritual practice when you don't see the light as strongly anymore. And so it is an important anchor. That is one of the functions of a proof or evidence for the existence of God, is it gives you that firm, rational belief, that abstract belief that's not really within your consciousness, is just a proposition that you know to be true about the nature of reality. So I hope that's kind of clear. And I believe a lot of those atheists who lost faith, perhaps they wouldn't have had they had that anchor of like, like a bunker in their belief system to say, okay, this definitely is true, and so I have to come back to that. Now, there is one last reason, which is that we have many different religions. Given that that's the case, we need to also employ a reason, because presumably all of these religions are giving some kind of spiritual experience, right? Particularly the major world religions, Hinduism, Taoism, Christianity, Islam, Judaism. These are giving some kind of experience of consciousness to their members, which is why these people are following that religion. It means something in their life. They feel the existence of they feel connectedness to some kind of higher power and so forth. Now, given that that's the case, we need to use reason here and say, okay, so are all of them true? Is only one of them true and the rest false? Are some of them true and some of them false? Here we need to use reason in order to, at least in part, maybe we can use immediate knowledge in a certain sense, but at least in part, we need to use reasons to parse these things out. Furthermore, there are specific theological claims which are made by certain religions or certain sects within certain religions. These have to be assessed using reason. So there's no way around getting into this kind of discussion with reason, because the details of which religion you're going to follow, which sect you're going to follow, whatever, it doesn't just come down to, okay, well, I know it's true in my heart, right? You might know God exists in your heart, sure, but the specific injunction to, I don't know, pray this way or that way or this many times a day or whatever, I mean, that's something that clearly we have to use reason as well here. It plays a role. So that's the fourth reason, I think, that we have to get into proofs and evidence for the existence of God. Now, the last topic that I wanted to cover was, what's going to satisfy you? As I said, there's going to be three ways that we're going to know that God exists. One is through immediate knowledge, the second is through deductive reasoning, and the third is through inductive reasoning. What I would actually say, and you can split this in another way where you can just go and say, for instance, you have let's say, it's like a split. You have immediate knowledge and immediate. And then this further splits into deduction and induction. Okay. Now, what I would say is that this is never really knowledge of God. This is knowledge about God. So let me just adjust this over here. So this is knowledge about God. This is knowledge of God. Okay. And the reason is because this is seeing the divine light within your consciousness is immediately grasped, whereas this is simply a concept which you are inferring represents external reality, which is not a concept, is not God. An experience, fundamental root of your nature of your consciousness, that is something that you can say is going to be attached with the divine. So what I would say is ultimately the only thing that's really going to satisfy somebody is immediate knowledge of God. That's the only thing that's going to satisfy a human being. However, if you are, let's say, having real doubts about the existence of God, then what a proof can do is exactly what we were talking about here. This applies as much to atheists, where this anchor over here, this proof, right, or evidence, is an anchor over here, which is going to push you. It's going to give you a reason to go through this spiritual journey. It's going to give you a reason to move in this direction. So some people, they can't just be like, look, I'm not going to experiment with my consciousness or whatever. I think this is a whole bunch of mumbo jumbo. Show me that this is at least a reasonable thing to believe, and then maybe I'll consider trying it out. Maybe I'll consider trying this spiritual practice out. And as we said, that this is a certain aspect of the human being. In the same way we like art, we like whatever, we're also reasonable creatures, and so somebody has to appeal to your reason. Given that that's the case, we need a proof. As I said, we need a proof for the existence of God, and this will satisfy. These two will kind of satisfy your intellectual curiosity. They will not satisfy the whole of your being. They'll satisfy one part of your being, or one aspect, one modality of your being, which is the rational modality of your being. But the rest of your being will be fully satisfied through immediate knowledge of the existence of God. So for that reason, I encourage people, if you want to know God exists, follow a religion that allows you, that you have confidence, allows you to experience the divine. Some Muslims out there might criticize me. What do you mean a religion? You should just say Islam, right? To which I would respond, yes, I believe Islam does give you knowledge of God. However, for knowledge of God, specific, just God alone, I do believe all of the monotheistic religions do give you that. That a Christian does experience God in some sense. I do believe that. That's going to be, that's not to say necessarily that Christianity is valid today. It is to say that somebody who follows Christianity sincerely, I do believe, has some kind of experience of God in their heart. I don't believe that, it's just some rational belief that's just out there in the abstract that they're falsely believing is true and what have you. No, there is something in the heart there, and I think it's for that reason that God commanded Muslims really to protect the synagogues and the churches, because God has remembered much in them. I do believe that these are all related. Now, so again, the discussion about what religion should a person follow today, that's a different discussion. For now, I'm just saying that if somebody is on complete atheism, follow a spiritual path that you can see, or at least you think will give you that immediate knowledge of God. I would personally advocate for Islam, because I believe it's the religion that takes God most seriously, particularly in the modern age, and I don't think you're going to get anywhere with Protestant Christianity in particular, and even nowadays Catholicism is not really going to get you there. Orthodox Christianity is a little bit more serious, and Hinduism is a mixed bag, but Islam is very much the clear path in my view to getting this basic knowledge of God through in your own consciousness. Okay, so coming back to what is going to satisfy you. Again, the rational proofs will satisfy the intellectual, rational aspect of your being. The root of your being really will be satisfied by this immediate knowledge, and hopefully we can get, both. Both would be useful. Some people want a 100%, no doubt about it, metaphysical demonstration. If that's the case, you want a deductive proof. And if that's the case, it's going to be painful. I'm warning you from now, because you're going to have to go through every single step in the reasoning, step by step, and be very minute and very particular. And most people really, they don't like reasoning like that because it's very painful. It's like math. But if that's the kind of thing that you're going for, you have to be willing to put in the work. That's what I would say to you. Some people are like, no, I don't need something that's 100%. I just need you to give me a good evidence that this is probably true, right? That there probably is a God. If you can give me that, I'll be satisfied. That's enough for me. So for those kind of people, just giving evidence and an inductive argument for the existence of God is sufficient. Once again, we'll be covering those in a future episode. So the last thing I wanted to say is this, that there are some people who, no matter what, actually will not be satisfied. There are some people who, no matter what, will not be satisfied, meaning even if you gave them a good inductive argument that shows that God probably exists, they're not going to be satisfied. If you gave them a metaphysical demonstration which goes, point by point through very meticulous reason to show them that God exists, they're not going to be satisfied. They will never have immediate knowledge of God, because you're going to tell them, listen, okay, you want to see God directly? Here, follow this spiritual prescription, do this spiritual practice, do good deeds, hold yourself from doing evil, and you will see the divine light. And they won't do that. In fact, they will say, I'm already good, things like this, right? So they don't believe they need to improve. They don't want to see God. They hate the idea of God existing. They resent being, in the words of Jordan Peterson. They hate the very idea of God. And for them, this whole thing really is a charade, this whole, oh, I'm rational and you're irrational and what have you. They're not really open to any kind of argument. The reason is because this is something that's almost, it's metaphysical at this point. It's no longer on the level of reason. They metaphysically reject the idea of God. They hate the idea of God. They hate the idea of submitting to a higher power. All of this enrages them. There's this rage and resentment in them, this darkness within them, and they don't want it. Now, I want to give you an example of this so you know exactly what I'm talking about. And here is just an example for that. So 1 second. Okay, so if you see this video, it has 8 million views and the vast majority like this video. Okay, so the reason why I'm saying this is because, as I said, you can see there, this is a metaphysical rejection of the existence of God. It's not something on the level of reason. He is saying, if I was there at the pearly gates, okay, I wouldn't beg for forgiveness. I wouldn't say, please take me in. He would, give it to God. So he's perfectly happy. He said, I don't want to get in on his terms because his terms are wrong. So he is more content to actually burn in hellfire than he is to submit to God. And I actually think a significant number of atheists, I'm not going to say the majority or all of them, I believe the majority of atheists, if you showed them a rational argument to believe in the existence of God, they would change their minds. But what I would say is that there is a minority of atheists that for them, it's not really about the reason. And I'm not saying people who have that metaphysical rejection of God can't change their minds either. Sometimes they do come around as well. But it requires a different kind of treatment. It's not really a question of what's the evidence, what are the arguments and what have you. It's a spiritual problem, an emotional problem with the idea of God and the existence of God, really. So that's one clip I wanted to show you. There's one more clip I also want to show you here. So this is on my blog here, which you guys can once again check out. I'll put links in the description below. This is Richard Dawkins. So there you see Richard Dawkins saying that, look, if, the second coming of Jesus happened, okay, he still wouldn't believe. He would be on the other side ready to oppose him. So there's two benefits to that clip. One is to show that sense perception is actually not the be all and end all, because you can actually see something and then infer something else. So that was going back to the point that I was making, that the sense perception is just an image that you're having in your mind. You're not seeing actual reality with that sense perception, right? We see stars out there that have burnt out, but the image is just now reaching us. And so we have an image of our mind, but the reality out there is that it's burnt out. Now, because it takes millions of light years to travel to Earth. Now, here you have Richard Dawkins. I mean, is this really, the second coming of Jesus, you would still reject God, right? You're going to say aliens are doing it, right? So nothing's going to convince him. Literally nothing is going to convince him. He doesn't want to believe. He's not going to believe. And it doesn't matter what evidence, whatever you bring, it comes to. Now, the point, just to conclude, is this. You have to think about what is going to satisfy you in terms of knowing that God exists. Are you looking for immediate knowledge of God? Are you looking for a deductive proof? Are you looking for good evidence? What's going to satisfy you? Think about that so that in the future series, you have that in mind. The reason why that's important is because sometimes there are people who say, you know what, I would be satisfied with just good evidence for the existence of God. And then you make a probabilistic argument to show, look, God probably exists based on this, that, and the other. And then they'll turn around and be like, oh, but there's still a probability that, this could all happen by chance, for instance. Okay, well, if that's the case, you weren't really interested in a probabilistic proof. Why did you say that you just wanted good evidence? You didn't want good evidence. What you wanted was a metaphysical demonstration. If you want a metaphysical demonstration, you have to be willing to do the work, right? And it's very difficult work to do that. We're going to do it here. But, you're going to have to do it. There's no way around it. And for some people, even if you give them that, they're still not going to be satisfied. So once again, what are you going to be satisfied with? Be honest with yourself, right? Is your, disbelief in God just an intellectual problem? Is it a spiritual problem? Because all of these are going to require different kind of treatment, in my view. So that's what I got for you guys today. My apologies that this video was not as, let's say, organized as I'd hope it would be. I'm still new to this, so be patient with me. My blog posts are more organized because I just have the time to think and reorganize paragraphs and things like that, whereas with video, it's just not as easy. So hopefully you guys enjoyed. Please do like, comment. If you have any questions, do comment. I will probably respond to them in a future episode, or a future video. I don't know why I'm calling them episodes, but whatever. What else? Share with your friends if you enjoyed this video. Subscribe and put the bell notification. Thank you very much. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.